Hi, there's increasing talk in Europe about deploying troops to Ukraine. I think such a move is still improbable. Nonetheless, the Overton window appears to be shifting. So the question is then, well, what if they do it? What cannot be denied is that a European military deployment of any kind will escalate the war and expand it. The question then becomes, well, by how much? What would it even look like? And how dangerous might the conflict plausibly become? In this video, I want to answer these questions. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, if you like anything in this video, please do me a favor and hit like and subscribe, because it really helps my channel a great deal. Let's back up. Now, in the past, the Soviets and the United States, thanks to nuclear weapons, had at least a tacit agreement that limited wars on the periphery of their vital national interests would remain just that. So the Korean, the Vietnam, and the Soviet-Afghan wars stayed in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. This was despite the fact that sometimes they were actually Soviets fighting Americans, pilots mostly, in Korea and Vietnam. The Arab-Israeli wars also stayed Arab-Israeli wars, notwithstanding the fact that sometimes Soviets, pilots again mostly, came into direct combat with Israelis. As far as I know, the only time the United States ever directly targeted Soviets or Russians was actually in 2018, when the United States wiped out a force of Wagner paramilitaries in Syria. Russia, which did not want to go to war over the matter, responded by washing its hands of the entire incident and leaned on the legal fiction that because Wagner was a private military contractor, or a PMC, therefore this wasn't Russian government, therefore it had nothing to do with the government and there was no need to respond. Of course, this is legal fiction, as I said before, because Wagner has always been an arm of the Russian state. Ukraine is different from Indochina and Syria, however, in that Russia considers its vital interests to be at stake. Moreover, the Biden administration relatedly authorized deep strikes into Russian territory. The British and the French likewise did the same. Now, already this expanded the scope of the war, right? So this is already very different and already much less of the kind of limited war that we were talking about before. Russians understandably would see a European military deployment as yet another step, yet another threat to its vital interests. But what would Russia actually do about it? A Russian ground invasion of NATO territory remains completely improbable, if for no other reason than the fact that the Russians, because they're already tied down in Ukraine, probably can't muster the kinds of forces that it would take in order to attempt such a thing. Besides, nothing would risk a full-blown war with NATO than an invasion of NATO turf. Moreover, Russian forces would probably get badly mauled if they attempted such a thing, and if they did get badly mauled, this would increase the likelihood that they might find it necessary, or think it necessary, to use nuclear weapons. I don't think the Russians are crazy enough to want to put themselves into that position. I believe also that the opposite is true, and that I don't strongly doubt that any European country would risk invading Russia. Rather, they'd go to Ukraine in order to fight in Ukraine. That being said, two things are possible, if not likely. The first is an escalation of what they call gray zone tactics that Russia already has been using against Europe. This includes mucking about internal domestic politics, which they've been doing plenty of, cyber attacks, and sabotage. Recently, for example, a DHL cargo plane crashed in Lithuania, and this comes not long after there was a report that surfaced that the GRU, which was the Russian military intelligence service, was looking into downing a DHL plane. On 17 November, so very recently, a Chinese ship, skippered, by the way, by a Russian, cut two communications cables in the Baltic Sea. Now, allegedly, this was an accident because they accidentally dragged their anchor across these cables, therefore cutting it. I don't think anybody believes this. There also have been plots targeting military bases and warehouses in Germany, and the Finns are concerned about recent break-ins at a water treatment plant. I would expect to see much more of that kind of incident, specifically targeting perhaps NATO countries that do send troops, as well as the infrastructure involved in transporting troops and supplying them. A second plausible form of retaliation would be long-range strikes against targets inside NATO territory, something that the Russians might consider fair play, considering that Ukraine now is doing strikes against targets in Russia. Now, would it matter if Europeans themselves conducted long-range strikes rather than simply supply Ukrainians with the means to do so, which is what they're already doing? Perhaps. But that wouldn't be necessary, I think, to justify in Russia's eyes strikes against, say, key infrastructure or perhaps any place where European forces are staging before entering Ukraine, not to mention any European forces that are actually in Ukraine. The nature and scale of Russian retaliation might depend in part on the nature and scale of any European deployment. The reported discussions in Europe about sending forces that I have seen have not gone into any detail about any concrete proposals, if there even are any concrete proposals, and we don't know this. Are we talking training missions? Are we talking special operations forces? Are we talking full armored brigades? Perhaps niche capabilities like sending Patriot missile batteries, operated by European troops. Might Britain and France activate its combined joint expeditionary force, which would transit into, say, like a combined brigade-sized force, maybe? Or maybe European air forces would join the fray in Ukraine's skies. I've also seen some news pieces suggesting that maybe British and French private military contractors, such as France's Défense Conseil International, would be deployed in some form or another. But it's really hard to know what to make of that. Now, the obvious appeal to sending private military contractors is that that's much more of a gray zone move, right? And European countries would therefore have the freedom of choosing not to respond to any attacks against them, right? Just like the way Russia didn't feel obliged to respond to the U.S. attack on Wagner forces in Syria. To be honest, I don't know really what to make of groups like the French DCI, the Défense Conseil International, and whether or not they would be useful. As far as I know, they're nothing like Wagner, at least in the sense that they cannot send large ground formations. But maybe they could send sort of special operations forces units, or given small tasks like operating air defense capabilities, maybe flying aircraft. The U.S., by the way, used contractors and also CIA personnel to fly combat missions in Congo in the 1960s, as well as Bay of Pigs. Maybe that's the model to follow, because again, it gives you a little bit of plausible deniability. If those guys were, you shot down that guy. Well, we don't know who that is. It's useful. It's a fiction, but it's useful, and that might be enough to limit any kind of escalation that might come from an attack on these sort of gray zone forces. Think about like Western little green men. So it stands to reason that the Russians will respond differently if Europe only sent trainers, advisors, or perhaps private military contractors on one end of the scale, or then full armored brigades on the other end of the scale. Europeans might also be able to reduce the escalatory risk by operating out of Ukraine rather than, say, NATO territory. Flying combat jets out of Romanian bases might increase the risk that the Russians might target those bases, rather than flying NATO jets out of Ukraine itself. The good news is that any Russian strike against European troops or targets in NATO need not trigger a giant war, especially given the unlikelihood that any European intervention would not actually be an official NATO endeavor. NATO as a body could never agree to such a thing, given its internal divisions and the fact that NATO requires a complete consensus. So if there were a proposal to send troops in at NATO, right, Germany would block that move, not to speak of Hungary or Turkey. Moreover, I suspect, and I hope, that Russia would be careful about what it targets. Bombing a parking lot in Poland full of Leopard tanks bound for Ukraine would be one thing. Bombing Warsaw would be another. I'm not opposed to European troop deployment. I welcome the idea of Europeans stepping up like that and helping Ukraine win its war. And helping Ukraine win its war might actually be worth the risk. I so regret the fact that the United States, back in January and February of 2022, when it was telling everybody that a big Russian invasion was imminent, did not deploy the 82nd Airborne to do nothing more than simply sit astride probable invasion routes. And by the way, nothing at the time was stopping the British, French, or any other NATO ally from doing that sort of thing either. Everybody instead waited to see what Biden would do, which unfortunately is typical of Europeans. Like, maybe the Americans will react, and we're going to sort of rely on the Americans to make a decision about what to do. However, I am against blithely dismissing the risk. Any European country that's contemplating deploying forces of any kind needs to be fully cognizant of what the Russians could do in response, and then also think through how it will respond to any act of aggression, be it a cyber attack or a missile strike. They have to have policies and responses already sort of prepared and thought through. They need to be wargaming this thing. The worst possible reaction would be a rash reaction, something that might snowball into a crisis that could very easily get out of anybody's control. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know what you think about all this in the comments below. In the description, I put links to my Twitter, LinkedIn, Blue Sky accounts, plus my own website, michaelshirkin.com, and my Substack, which also goes by the name Pax Americana. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. There's plenty of stuff in the pipeline, and have a great holiday. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thank you very much.